I knew something was wrong when I heard 15 screaming children through the walls of our HOA clubhouse at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday. My name is Warren Quincy, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona, for 6 years without any major problems. The community was nice enough, with its beige stucco houses, desert landscaping, and a common area that included a pool, a small gym, and a clubhouse that residents could reserve for parties and events. The HOA had always been reasonable, at least until Brenda Morrison took over as president about 8 months ago. Brenda was the kind of woman who wore her authority like a crown. She was 47, always dressed in crisp business casual outfits, even though she didn't have a job outside of managing the HOA. And she had that particular haircut that seemed to be issued along with a certain attitude. You know the one. Shoulder length, heavily highlighted, usually pulled back with expensive sunglasses perched on top. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read HOA Boss, which should have been my first warning sign. That Tuesday morning, I was walking my dog Baxter past the clubhouse when the noise hit me. It wasn't just loud, it was chaos. Children shrieking, someone banging on what sounded like pots and pans, and underneath it all, a woman's voice trying and failing to establish order. I stopped on the sidewalk, Baxter pulling at his leash to investigate. The clubhouse blinds were drawn, which was unusual. Normally, the building sat empty during weekdays unless someone had reserved it for an event. I pulled out my phone and checked the HOA's reservation calendar, something I had access to as a homeowner. Nothing was scheduled. The sound of breaking glass came from inside, followed by a child wailing. I approached the front door, which was slightly ajar. Through the gap, I could see what looked like a disaster zone. Toys were scattered everywhere, juice boxes littered the floor, and children ranging from what looked like 2 to 5 years old were running wild through the space we normally used for book clubs and retirement parties. "Excuse me," I called out, pushing the door open wider. A harried-looking woman in her 20s spun around, a screaming toddler on her hip. "We're closed." "Closed to what?" "This is the HOA clubhouse." She looked panicked, her eyes darting to a back room. "You need to leave, private event." Before I could respond, Brenda Morrison emerged from what I knew was the clubhouse kitchen. She was carrying a tray of apple slices and looked completely unfazed by the pandemonium around her. "Warren," she said, her voice sugary sweet in that way that made my teeth hurt. "What brings you by?" "I could ask you the same thing. What's going on here?" "Just a little gathering. Nothing that concerns you." She set down the apple slices, and 3 children immediately swarmed the tray, pushing and shoving each other. It concerns me when I hear what sounds like a riot happening in our shared community space. I looked around more carefully now. There were at least 15 children that I could count, maybe more. Pack-and-plays were set up in corners. Diaper bags hung on every available hook. The kitchen had been converted into what looked like a food prep station, with industrial-sized containers of goldfish crackers and graham crackers lining the counters. "I have every right to use this space," Brenda said, her tone sharpening. "I'm the HOA president, for personal use." "To run what looks like a daycare," her eyes narrowed. "I suggest you mind your own business, Warren, unless you want to find yourself facing fines for violations. I noticed your garage door has been left open overnight 3 times this month. That's a $50 fine per occurrence." It was a threat, plain and simple, but I wasn't about to be intimidated. "Who authorized this use of the clubhouse?" "I did. As president, I have the authority to approve reservations. For your own commercial business, this isn't a business. It's a cooperative childcare arrangement among friends." I looked at the chaos around us. One kid was trying to climb the curtains. Another had discovered the thermostat and was pressing buttons randomly. The young woman I'd first seen was now chasing a little boy who had somehow gotten hold of a permanent marker. "How long has this been going on?" "That's none of your concern. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have things to attend to." Brenda turned her back on me dismissively. I left, but I wasn't done. Back at my house, I started making calls. First, I contacted other HOA board members. We had 5 total, including Brenda. When I reached Martin Chen, our treasurer, he sounded shocked. "She's doing what?" "Running a daycare out of the clubhouse." Every day, from what I could tell by the setup. This isn't something that just started today. She never brought this to a board vote. "Warren, this is a massive liability issue. If someone gets hurt, if there's an accident, the HOA's insurance won't cover it. We could all be personally liable." "That's what I was thinking. Let me make some calls. Can you document what you saw? Take photos if possible." Over the next few days, I made it my mission to gather evidence. I walked past the clubhouse every morning and afternoon, noting the arrival and departure times of parents dropping off children. I photographed the line of cars that formed around 7 a.m. and again around 5 p.m. I recorded the sounds coming from inside, the crying and yelling and general mayhem. Other neighbors started noticing too. The community Facebook page lit up with complaints. People were upset they couldn't reserve the clubhouse for legitimate events because it was constantly blocked off for maintenance, according to Brenda's calendar entries. Someone pointed out that their daughter's birthday party reservation had been mysteriously canceled at the last minute. At the emergency board meeting Martin called for that Friday evening, Brenda showed up with a lawyer. That should have been my second warning that this was bigger than I thought. "This meeting is inappropriate and wasn't called with proper notice," her lawyer said immediately. He was young, probably fresh out of law school, with a cheap suit and an expensive briefcase that didn't match. "The bylaws allow for emergency meetings when there are urgent matters affecting the community," Martin said calmly. He was a retired accountant, methodical and detail-oriented. "The unauthorized commercial use of HOA property qualifies." "There is no commercial use," Brenda snapped. "I've already explained this. It's a child care cooperative." "Then why are parents paying you?" This came from Sandra Williams, the secretary, who had apparently done her own investigating. She pulled out printed screenshots of Venmo transactions. $240 per week per child. That's nearly $4,000 a week you're collecting. Brenda's face went red. "Those are voluntary contributions to offset costs." "What costs?" Martin asked. "The clubhouse utilities are already paid for by HOA dues. You're not renting the space. Where is this money going?" "That's my personal business." "It becomes HOA business when you're operating a commercial enterprise on HOA property without authorization," Sandra said. "Not to mention the liability issues. Are you even licensed to run a daycare?" "I don't need a license for a cooperative." "Actually," I spoke up, having done my research, "in Arizona, any child care facility serving more than 4 children from different families requires state licensing. It doesn't matter if you call it a cooperative or a business. The law is clear." Brenda's lawyer whispered something to her. She shook her head violently. "You're all just jealous because I found a way to serve the community while providing a needed service. You're using community resources for personal profit," Martin said. "That's a breach of your fiduciary duty as president. The board votes to immediately revoke your access to the clubhouse for this purpose." "You can't do that." "We just did. 3 votes in favor. Your vote doesn't count due to conflict of interest and Janet is absent. Motion carries." I expected Brenda to back down. I really did. Instead, she doubled down. The next Monday morning, she was back in the clubhouse with all the kids. When Martin went to confront her, she had changed the locks. When he threatened to call the police, she said she'd file harassment charges against the entire board. "This is insane," I told Martin over the phone. "She's completely out of control." "I know. I've contacted our HOA attorney. He says we can force the issue, but it's going to get ugly." It got uglier faster than anyone expected. That Wednesday, I was working from home when I heard sirens. Multiple fire trucks screamed into our subdivision, heading straight for the clubhouse. I ran outside along with half the neighborhood. Smoke was pouring from the clubhouse kitchen. Parents were arriving in a panic, some still in work clothes, desperate to get to their children. Firefighters were evacuating kids, carrying out crying toddlers and frightened preschoolers. Brenda was standing in the parking lot, her face pale, arguing with a firefighter who looked like he'd had enough. "Madam, I don't care what you think you're running here. That kitchen isn't rated for commercial use. You had a grease fire because you were trying to cook lunch for 20 children on residential equipment, and you have exit doors blocked with play equipment. This is a death trap. It was a small fire. I had it under control. You had flames reaching the ceiling and no fire extinguisher in sight. If that parent hadn't called 911 when they saw smoke through the window, we could be dealing with dead children right now." The words hung in the air. Several parents gasped. One mother started crying. Another firefighter, this one with a chief's insignia, approached. He looked at the building, then at Brenda, then at the crowd of children and parents. "Who's in charge here?" "I am. I'm Brenda Morrison, HOA president. You running a daycare, it's a cooperative. Licensed." Brenda hesitated just long enough for the answer to be obvious. "Right." The fire chief pulled out a radio. "I need a fire marshal at the Meadowbrook Hills clubhouse. We've got an unlicensed commercial childcare operation with multiple code violations." "You can't do this," Brenda said, but her voice had lost its authority. "Madam, I can and I am. This facility is hereby closed for occupancy pending inspection. If you attempt to operate here again, you'll be arrested." The fire marshal showed up 20 minutes later with a clipboard and a grim expression. Her name was Rachel Vasquez, and she was thorough. She walked through the entire clubhouse, taking photos, making notes, and shaking her head. When she emerged, she posted a red tag on the front door. "This building is unsafe for occupancy until the following violations are corrected," she read from her report. Blocked emergency exits, inadequate fire suppression equipment, improper use of commercial cooking equipment in a non-rated kitchen, exceeding occupancy limits, lack of proper licensing for commercial childcare use, no posted evacuation plan, no fire drills documented, and unsafe storage of cleaning chemicals accessible to children. "How long will it be closed?" Martin asked. He'd arrived during the evacuation, looking devastated that things had gotten this bad. "That's up to the property owner to fix the violations and request reinspection. But given that this is a HOA facility, you'll also need to address the licensing issues if you want to allow childcare operations, which I strongly advise against given the structure's design." Brenda tried one more time. "I have parents who need childcare." "You're putting them in a terrible position." Rachel Vasquez fixed her with a hard stare. "You put their children in a terrible position when you decided to run an unlicensed facility in an inappropriate building. Those parents should be grateful their kids are alive. A grease fire in a room full of toddlers. You understand how fast that could have turned into a mass casualty event." Finally, Brenda seemed to grasp the seriousness of the situation. Her face crumpled, and for the first time, she looked scared instead of defiant. But the fire marshal wasn't done. "I'm also referring this to the Arizona Department of Health Services. Operating an unlicensed childcare facility is a Class 1 misdemeanor. They'll conduct their own investigation. A criminal charge. Brenda's voice was small. Yes, madam. You knowingly operated a facility serving more than 4 unrelated children without proper licensing. That's illegal in Arizona. Over the next few weeks, the full scope of what Brenda had been doing came to light. The state investigation revealed that she'd been running the daycare for 6 months, collecting nearly $25,000 in fees. She hadn't reported any of it as income. She had no insurance, no background checks on the young woman she'd hired to help her, no emergency medical plans, and no training in child safety or first aid. The parents who had been using her service were horrified when they learned the truth. Many of them had thought it was a legitimate, if casual, arrangement. They'd trusted Brenda because she was the HOA president, assuming that meant she had authority and accountability. They hadn't known about the lack of licensing or the safety violations. 3 families filed civil suits against Brenda for endangering their children. The HOA's insurance company sent a letter threatening to drop our coverage if we didn't remove Brenda from the board immediately and implement new oversight procedures. At the next board meeting, Brenda was voted out as president with a unanimous decision from the other 4 board members. She didn't attend the meeting. Martin told me she'd hired a criminal defense attorney to handle the state charges. The clubhouse remained closed for 2 months while the HOA paid for repairs and upgrades to bring it back to code. The total cost was $18,000, which had to come from our reserve fund. That meant no other capital improvements could happen that year, and there was talk of a special assessment if the legal fees got too high. I ran into Brenda once during this period at the grocery store. She looked terrible, like she hadn't been sleeping. When she saw me, she tried to turn her cart around and go the other way. "Brenda," I called out. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted some kind of explanation. She stopped but didn't turn around. "What do you want, Warren? Come to gloat." "No, I just want to understand. Why did you do it?" She finally turned to face me. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Do you know what it's like to be invisible? I spent 20 years raising my own kids, being a stay-at-home mom, doing everything for my family. Then they grew up and moved out, and my husband decided he wanted a younger wife. I was divorced and alone in a house I could barely afford, with no job skills and no purpose. So you decided to run an illegal daycare. I decided to be useful again, to be needed. Those kids needed me, and those parents needed affordable child care. Do you know how expensive licensed daycare is in Scottsdale? $300 a week per child minimum. I was charging $240 and actually spending time with them, not warehousing them. You almost killed them. That's not fair. The fire was an accident waiting to happen. Brenda, you had no training, no safety equipment, no emergency plans. What if one of those kids had a severe allergic reaction? What if there had been a real emergency?" She looked away. "I thought I was doing the right thing. You were doing the profitable thing. $25,000 isn't nothing. I needed that money. My alimony barely covers my mortgage. I was trying to survive. I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it died quickly. Not at the expense of children's safety, and not by abusing your position in the HOA. The HOA gave me power when I had none anywhere else." That, I thought, was the realest thing she'd said. Brenda Morrison hadn't been a cartoon villain. She'd been a desperate woman who found a little bit of authority and twisted it into something toxic, because she felt powerless everywhere else in her life. But understanding her motivation didn't excuse her actions. The state charges moved forward. In Arizona, operating an unlicensed childcare facility is taken seriously, especially after an incident. Brenda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in going easy on her. The grease fire had made the news, and there was public pressure to hold her accountable. The trial was set for late fall. I was called as a witness, along with Martin, Sandra, and several of the parents. The young woman Brenda had hired to help her, whose name was Jessica, turned state's witness. She testified that she'd asked Brenda multiple times about licensing and had been assured it wasn't necessary for a cooperative arrangement. "I was just out of college," Jessica said on the stand, crying. "I needed a job and she said it was all legal. I didn't know any better. When the fire started, I tried to get all the kids out, but there were so many of them and they were panicking. I thought we were going to die." The fire marshal testified about the violations she'd found. The state licensing inspector testified about the requirements Brenda had ignored. Martin testified about how she'd bypassed the board and used HOA resources for personal gain. When I was called, the prosecutor asked me to describe what I'd first seen that Tuesday morning. "Chaos," I said. "Complete chaos. Too many children in too small a space with too little supervision. It looked dangerous even before I knew about the lack of licensing or safety measures." "Did Mrs. Morrison seem concerned about safety when you spoke with her?" "No. She seemed concerned about maintaining control of the situation and threatening me when I questioned her authority." Brenda's defense attorney tried to paint her as a well-meaning woman who made mistakes, but never intended harm. He called character witnesses who spoke about her years of volunteer work with the HOA and her dedication to her own children when they were young. But the prosecution had the photos from the fire marshal, the testimony from multiple witnesses, and the financial records showing she'd collected and hidden significant income. They also had evidence that she'd been warned by Jessica about safety concerns and had ignored them. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They found Brenda guilty of operating an unlicensed child care facility and guilty of reckless endangerment, a more serious charge related to the fire and the safety violations. At sentencing 2 weeks later, the judge didn't hold back. "Mrs. Morrison, you held a position of trust in your community and you abused it. You put children in danger for profit. While I don't believe you intended to harm anyone, your reckless disregard for safety regulations and your refusal to follow the law resulted in a dangerous situation that could have been catastrophic." Brenda was sentenced to 6 months in jail, though she'd be eligible for work release after 30 days. She was also ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the repair costs and fined $15,000. She'd have to complete 200 hours of community service after her release, and she was prohibited from ever working with children in any capacity. As the bailiff led her away, Brenda looked back at the courtroom. Her eyes found mine for just a moment. I don't know what she saw in my face. I wasn't happy about any of this, just relieved it was over. The civil suits from the families were settled out of court. Brenda's house went into foreclosure shortly after, the legal fees and fines having wiped out what little savings she had. I heard through the neighborhood gossip chain that she moved to Texas after serving her sentence, to live with a sister. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had to rebuild its reputation and its procedures. Martin became the new president, and one of his first acts was to implement a strict policy requiring board votes for any use of community property and prohibiting board members from using their positions for personal financial gain. We also got better insurance and established an oversight committee to prevent any one person from having too much unchecked authority. The clubhouse eventually reopened with new fire suppression equipment, clearly marked emergency exits, and a strict policy that it could only be used for its intended purpose, as a community gathering space. The first event held there after the renovation was a neighborhood meeting about safety and community standards. Nearly every homeowner attended. During that meeting, one of the parents whose child had been in Brenda's care stood up to speak. Her name was Rachel Martinez, and she looked exhausted. "I want to say something," she started, her voice shaky. "I used Brenda's service because I was desperate. Good daycare in this area costs more than I make in a week. When she offered something affordable right here in the neighborhood, it seemed like an answer to prayer. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't check for licensing. I just trusted her because she was the HOA president and that seemed official." She paused, wiping her eyes. "My daughter could have died in that fire. When I think about what almost happened, I can't breathe. I'm angry at Brenda, but I'm also angry at myself for not being more careful. And I'm angry at a system that makes childcare so expensive that people like me are vulnerable to situations like this." Her words resonated with a lot of people in the room. Several other parents nodded. The reality was that Brenda had exploited a genuine need, and while her methods were illegal and dangerous, the desperation that had driven parents to use her service was real. "Going forward," Martin said after Rachel sat down, "I think we need to be honest about the fact that this happened not just because one person made bad choices, but because our community wasn't paying attention. We need to be more engaged, ask more questions, and not assume that positions of authority automatically mean accountability." It was a good speech, and he was right. The whole situation had been a wake-up call for Meadowbrook Hills. We'd all been sleepwalking through HOA meetings and community decisions, happy to let someone else handle the details as long as our own lives weren't disrupted. 6 months after the trial, I was elected to the HOA board as the new vice president. I never thought I'd want to be that involved, but the whole experience had changed my perspective. If I wanted to live in a well-run community, I needed to be part of making that happen. My first project was organizing a proper vetting system for anyone seeking to use HOA facilities. We created a reservation system with clear rules, insurance requirements for certain types of events, and regular inspections of the buildings to ensure they stayed in good condition and met all safety codes. We also partnered with a local licensed childcare center to offer information sessions for parents about choosing safe childcare and understanding licensing requirements. It wasn't our job to provide childcare, but we could at least help educate our residents about the resources available and the red flags to watch for. The young woman, Jessica, who had worked for Brenda, actually attended one of those sessions. She approached me afterward. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for reporting what was happening. I felt trapped. I needed the job, but I knew something was wrong. When you started asking questions, it gave me permission to stop pretending everything was okay. I'm sorry you got caught up in it. I learned a lot from it. I'm actually going to school now to become a licensed childcare provider. The right way. I really do love working with kids, but I want to do it safely and legally." "That's great. I'm glad something positive came out of this mess." She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her. "I heard you're on the board now. Good. We need people who actually care." As I walked home from the clubhouse that evening, Baxter trotting beside me, I thought about how much had changed in less than a year. Our quiet subdivision had been turned upside down by one woman's bad decisions and desperate circumstances. But in the aftermath, we'd become a stronger community, more aware and more engaged. The desert air was cooling as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Our neighborhood looked peaceful, the houses glowing with warm light as families settled in for dinner. It was easy to take that peace for granted, to assume that everything would just keep running smoothly without any effort. Brenda Morrison had taught us that wasn't true. She'd shown us how quickly things could go wrong when authority was abused and oversight was lacking. But she'd also, inadvertently, given us an opportunity to build something better. I thought about her sometimes, wondering how she was doing in Texas, whether she'd found some kind of peace or purpose that didn't involve exploiting others. I hoped so, even though I knew the damage she'd caused would take a long time to heal for the families affected. The Meadowbrook Hills clubhouse now had a plaque near the entrance that read, "Community spaces are a privilege and a responsibility. May we always use them wisely and for the benefit of all." It had been Martin's idea, a reminder of what we'd learned. 2 years after everything happened, I ran into Rachel Martinez again at a neighborhood barbecue. Her daughter was there, now 7 years old, happy and healthy and completely unaware of how close she'd come to tragedy. "How are you doing?" I asked Rachel. "Better. We found a good licensed daycare, and I got a raise at work that helps with the cost. My daughter is thriving." She watched her daughter playing with other kids near the pool. "Sometimes I still have nightmares about that day, about the smoke and the sirens, but mostly I'm just grateful." "That's good. You know what's weird? I saw Brenda recently." "You did?" "Here, no, on Facebook. She posted something about volunteering at a women's shelter in Texas, helping single mothers navigate resources and support systems. That's unexpected." "Yeah. I don't know if I can forgive her for what she did, but maybe she's actually learned something. Maybe she found a way to help people without putting them in danger." I hoped that was true. Redemption is complicated, especially when children's lives have been put at risk. But people are complicated too, capable of both terrible choices and genuine change. Life in Meadowbrook Hills continued on. We had our usual HOA dramas, the inevitable disputes about landscaping and parking and paint colors. But nothing came close to the chaos of Brenda's unlicensed daycare. We'd survived a crisis, learned our lessons, and come out stronger on the other side. Martin served as president for 3 years before stepping down to focus on his family. I took over after him, something I never would have imagined before all of this happened. The role wasn't about power or control, at least not the way Brenda had seen it. It was about service and stewardship, about taking care of a shared resource for the benefit of everyone. The clubhouse got regular use for birthday parties, book clubs, community meetings, and holiday gatherings. It was maintained properly, inspected regularly, and most importantly, it was safe. The kitchen was used only for its intended purpose, with proper equipment and supervision. The emergency exits were always clear. Fire extinguishers were checked monthly. These things sound boring, the mundane details of community management, but they matter. They're the difference between a safe gathering space and a death trap. They're the difference between a community that functions and one that falls apart. I learned that lesson the hard way, watching our neighborhood nearly destroyed by one woman's recklessness. But in learning it, I became a better homeowner, a better neighbor, and eventually, a better leader. Sometimes on quiet mornings when I walked Baxter past the clubhouse, I remembered that Tuesday when I first heard those 15 screaming children. I remembered the chaos, the panic of the fire, the long process of justice and recovery. Those memories didn't haunt me, but they kept me vigilant. They reminded me why the work of maintaining a community mattered, why oversight and accountability weren't just bureaucratic nuisances, but essential safeguards. Brenda Morrison's story became a cautionary tale in our HOA and beyond. Other subdivisions in Scottsdale heard about what happened and tightened their own policies. The local news did a follow-up story about unlicensed childcare operations and how to spot them. Our experience, as painful as it was, created awareness that potentially protected other children in other communities. That was cold comfort to the families who had been directly affected, who still dealt with the trauma of that day. But it was something. Out of one woman's terrible choices and the chaos they created, something good had emerged. Not enough to justify what happened, but enough to give it meaning. I still live in Meadowbrook Hills. My house is paid off now, and Baxter has been joined by a younger dog named Scout. The neighborhood continues to evolve, with new families moving in and older residents moving on. But the lessons we learned during that difficult year remain embedded in our community culture. We pay attention now. We ask questions. We don't assume that authority equals accountability. We take responsibility for our shared spaces and our shared safety. These aren't revolutionary concepts, but in practice, they've made all the difference. The last time I stood at the podium in the clubhouse for an HOA meeting, I looked out at the faces of my neighbors and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for what we'd been through, but for what we'd become because of it. A real community, not just people living near each other, but people committed to taking care of each other and the space we shared. Brenda Morrison had wanted power and purpose. She'd found both, but in all the wrong ways through exploitation and recklessness. The irony was that real power in a community comes from service, and real purpose comes from helping others thrive, not profiting from their desperation. I'd learned that, and so had Meadowbrook Hills. We'd learned it the hard way, through fire and crisis and consequence. But we'd learned it thoroughly, and that knowledge became the foundation of everything we built afterward. As I locked up the clubhouse that evening after another successful community event, I paused to read the plaque by the door. Community spaces are a privilege and a responsibility. May we always use them wisely and for the benefit of all. Simple words, but they carried the weight of everything we'd survived. They were a promise and a warning, a reminder and a commitment. They were, in their own way, a memorial to the crisis that had nearly destroyed us and a testament to how we'd rebuilt. I walked home through the cool desert evening, my dogs keeping pace beside me, my neighbor's lights glowing warm in the darkness. Somewhere in Texas, Brenda Morrison was presumably living her own life, carrying her own consequences and hopefully finding her own redemption. Here in Scottsdale, in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision, life went on with the hard-earned wisdom that safety, accountability, and community matter more than convenience, profit, or power. That Tuesday morning, when I'd heard screaming children through the clubhouse walls, seemed like a lifetime ago. In some ways it was. We were different people now, a different community, shaped by crisis and strengthened by how we'd responded to it. The unlicensed daycare, the fire, the trial, all of it had become part of our history, the story we told ourselves about who we were and what we valued. And in the end, that story had a simple moral that every community needs to remember, one that I carried with me through my years of HOA service and beyond. When someone abuses authority, speaks up. When something seems wrong, investigate. When safety is at stake, act. Don't wait for someone else to handle it. Don't assume that titles mean accountability. Don't let convenience override caution. These lessons, learned through the chaos Brenda Morrison created, became the bedrock of how Meadowbrook Hills operated. They weren't exciting or dramatic, just steady principles that kept us safe and functional. But steady principles are exactly what a community needs. Years later, when new residents moved in, they'd hear the story about the HOA president who ran an unlicensed daycare from the clubhouse until the fire marshal shut it down. Some would be shocked, others skeptical, most fascinated by the drama of it all. But the real story wasn't the drama, It was what came after, how a community faced a crisis, held someone accountable, and rebuilt itself stronger than before. That was the story worth telling, the one I carried with me long after Brenda Morrison had faded from our daily lives into memory and cautionary tale. It was a story about ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation and choosing to do the hard work of making things right. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but genuinely and completely. And every time I walked past that clubhouse with its clear exits, working fire extinguishers, and that simple plaque by the door, I was reminded that the work of community is never finished. It requires constant attention, regular maintenance, and the willingness to speak up when something goes wrong. Those lessons, learned through fire and chaos, remained as relevant years later as they were on that Tuesday morning when everything first began to unravel. Brenda Morrison had tried to turn community resources into personal profit, had endangered children for money, had abused authority for power. She'd failed, been caught, been punished, and presumably learned her lesson the hard way. But her failure had taught the rest of us lessons too, ones we wouldn't forget. The sun set over Meadowbrook Hills, another peaceful evening in a neighborhood that had earned its peace through vigilance and hard work. The clubhouse stood solid and safe, a gathering place for a community that now understood its value and its vulnerability. And somewhere in all of that, in the ordinary miracle of a functional HOA and a safe community space, was the real ending to this story, one without drama but full of meaning. We had survived Brenda Morrison's chaos and built something better from the ashes of her failures. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.